Great. Thank you, Anastasia. And thank you all for coming out today. My name is Anna Green. I'm the Director for Policy and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee for their U.S. programs based here in D.C. I wanted to start my presentation by, mentioning that IRC is a resettlement agency. We're also doing, to a very limited degree, some post-release services with UACs here in the U.S., in Miami, for example, in partnership with Heartland Alliance. But we are also, and this is really what our brand is known for, an emergency response agency. And we are involved in all four of the level 3 emergencies, like Syria. We're on the front lines of Ebola, et cetera. We're not in Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala, but we are doing a lot of advocacy on the root causes. And that is because as an emergency response agency, we see this as a humanitarian crisis. And it's not a crisis because the border control stations are overrun at the border. We see that the fact that children are, coming into our country and, being turned over to ORR as part of the protection response, not as a crisis or a problem. So I just wanted to mention that, for us, it was a real wake-up call, the Children on the Run report that UNHCR put out, and it changed our way of looking at this. We're only present in Haiti in this whole region because we work in the most complex emergencies. And although this situation may not look like Haiti, it may not look like Syria, it doesn't look like Nigeria exactly, it is a situation which we really want to call attention to for what it is. And that is a situation which really calls on not just USAID and not just, certain parts of State Department that deal with narcotics response. It really requires a response by the population, refugees, and migration part of our government, who are currently pretty absent from the scene, quite honestly, because of the narrative of this situation. And so we're trying to change that narrative, and we really are looking for bridges with the immigration community to help us do that. So I wanted to start with policy and advocacy, with the advocacy platforms that we're a part of, talking about the fact that, resettlement takes place in a much wider context, and the context in this program is different than the context that we do refugee resettlement in, let's say, from Kakuma camp. And I wanted to highlight 3 ways that it's different. The context is different because it's a context playing out just to the south of our own border. So it's a context which involves an interception and an enforcement response, which is creating perversions in the messaging. So while the U.S. government is demanding that countries like Lebanon keep their borders open to Syrians, who is the actor who is demanding that the U.S. border keep open? Well, it's just us. It's our community, and it's all of you. So that's the first big question. That we have a very significant barrier in this case on the right to seek and enjoy asylum, and that the response is built around that. The second major difference is that these children are still in their own country for this program, for example, and that means that during the process, during the resettlement processing, they may still be at risk. You may be in Kakuma and it may be miserable, but you're safe there, at least safe from your persecutors. You may have other protection problems there. But so that is a very different place to start in terms of what the protection and advocacy needs are. The third major difference is that UNHCR is not involved in this program. The vast majority of refugees who are brought to this country through the refugee resettlement program, their claims were adjudicated by UNHCR, they were presented by UNHCR, and during processing, UNHCR is there through their own staff and through their partner agencies like IRC and like Save the Children, et cetera, to provide wraparound services for that child while they're being processed. They may be doing things like doing best interest determinations, and they would be responding to risk situations that the child has during the processing. So these are 3 major contextual differences that we have to understand when we think about what are the protection concerns in the context of the Central American Minors Resettlement Program. So these are just a few. I tried to limit myself to 3 slides, and it was really hard. So these are just a few of the protection concerns that members of Refugee Council USA, resettlement agencies, and other partners have been talking about. So We're very concerned, like someone already mentioned, how long it takes for a child to get there. Are they safe when they, is it safe for them? And even cost effective, or how do they pay to get to a processing location that may be 9 hours away from their home and they have to go there 4 times? So we are definitely concerned and looking at the whole issue of the accessibility of the processing locations. We are also thinking about and concerned about the potential risks of being associated with the program. So if a local gang member or a trafficker or a smuggler is aware that a child has applied for this, and that sets a red flag for them because it means, oh, they have a parent who's in the U.S., does that bring upon the child additional risks? Risk for extortion, risks for, fraud in terms of, approaching that child and saying, pay me money and I'll get you through this program, etc. We're also very concerned about the fact that currently there is no established referral mechanism for that child who's in the process to UNHCR or an NGO or a government entity that can provide the protection or the wraparound services that that child may need at the moment that they apply. So it's not really clear to us yet whether the RSC will be doing any type of risk assessment when the children walk in the door to know whether that child, while they're going through it, may be at risk in their home. They may be already homeless, or they may already be facing a situation of intrafamily violence. They may already feel like they're, in the eye of the gangs. So we don't really know right now whether the program is going to take steps to identify those problems and then refer that child on to someone who can help. Because the RSC's role is not to do anything other than to process the child's application. So we are very concerned that these referral mechanisms do not exist. Although I said that UNHCR is not involved in the program, UNHCR has re-entered these 3 countries. They do have staff on the ground. So where there's a will, there's a way. There could be referrals to UNHCR and their partners. So that's something we're looking at. We're also a bit concerned. We don't really know what this will look like yet, but there is no best interest process. And we will eventually see situations where there may be conflicts of, let's take an example that there's a lawful parent here in the U.S., but the child is already with a parent there, but that parent doesn't qualify because they're not legally married to this parent. And let's just imagine that parent says, I don't want my kid to go. I want the kid here, and the parent in the U.S. wants to petition for them. That requires a best interest determination to resolve the conflicts of, and to determine what is really in the best interest of that child to move forward. So we're concerned that mechanism does not yet exist. There's also no mechanisms yet to follow up on the protection concerns and the situation of children who might be rejected from the program. And there's certainly no mechanisms for protection response for the much, much, much wider group of children in these countries who do not qualify to apply at all. So a lot of our advocacy of the resettlement agencies is not just around the children who qualify for the CAM, but what is happening with the children in these countries who have no option to even apply. I already mentioned the need to expand the eligibility criteria. And of course, the last bucket of issues for the children in their home countries is the whole issue of interception. So we go to the next. So what types of things are we advocating for? Like I said, safe shelter, a protection risk assessment, referral mechanisms for services. We're also advocating for UNHCR to receive more funding and to ramp up its protection activities in country, to include case management for the most at-risk children who may be in this process, bids and BIAs where appropriate. We have also flagged the potential need to create an emergency transit mechanism so that a child who is being processed, who might be at risk for, forcible gang recruitment, or who might face, another unsustainable situation, could be moved to a third country into safety, into a program while they await their decision for the U.S. So this is sort of like an evacuation to be processed in a third country. This type of mechanism exists around the world for other in other regions outside of the Americas. And we're also advocating that Central American children who are fleeing to third countries, let's say children who might be fleeing to Costa Rica or Nicaragua, Leslie showed us the figures, the 700 and odd percentage increase in the number of children and adults fleeing to those countries, that those children, if they qualify for asylum in those locations, that they would also have access to resettlement and family reunification to the United States where that was called for, regardless of the status of the parent. If a Honduran child is recognized as a refugee in Costa Rica, there's no impediment whatsoever for UNHCR to submit them to U.S. resettlement, even if their parent is undocumented. There is no impediment. In fact, there's a special program for those kids, the URM, the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, which a number of the voluntary agencies implement, which is designed for that scenario. So we want to make sure that those Central American kids are not being forgotten in this scenario. If we can go to the next. So we're also, a number of us in this room are also doing advocacy on U.S. foreign aid on the situation. And we're doing so in partnership with other actors who are far more expert than the resettlement agencies in development and foreign aid strategies in Latin America. We're partnering with organizations like the Washington Office on Latin America. The AFL-CIO is very active on this, the Jesuit Conference, JRS, Catholic Relief Services, these types of organizations that are not doing refugee resettlement here in the United States, but their focus is on the foreign aid strategy. So we've really been trying to bridge these two communities together, the resettlement community with the community of folks who are expert in what a foreign aid strategy needs to look like. Here, I wanted to mention just a couple of the issues that we've been looking at. One is that we're really trying to advocate that the root causes piece be addressed in the appropriate way. By that I mean, as most of you know, the President has asked for $1 billion for the Central America response for FY16. And the money that the President gets for that, however much is appropriated by Congress, is basically going into one of three pots. It's going into a USAID pot, it's going into a State Department pot, principally for international narcotics and law enforcement, INL, sorry, not INA, that's something else. And it's going into a third pot, which is the Department of Homeland Security pot. So you have one pot for development and two pots for enforcement. Where is the humanitarian pot? It's not there. Pretty much the way that we see it, the State Department is putting all of their humanitarian eggs in one basket, and that's the Central American Minors Program. And that is a recipe for failure. So we need to see that this pot of money has an appropriate level of assistance through, the U.S. foreign aid for the humanitarian response. And that means for things like funding UNHCR. It means funding NGOs who are implementing child protection responses, both emergency responses and longer-term responses to build the national child protection systems in these countries. So it means giving more money for appropriate repatriation and reintegration programs for those who are lawfully deported. And it means also, all of this means that the way that the aid is structured is in a way that our U.S. foreign assistance does not support the interception and deportation practices without asylum safeguards of the other countries, such as Mexico. So this is just, I'm trying to be brief because I've got limited time, but this is just to give you a little taste of the kind of issues which we're dealing with. And again, this goes much beyond the resettlement advocacy that we might do. The resettlement. The creation of a resettlement program is very complex. It takes time, and we will, of course, be dealing with all the bumps along the way. We will be discovering the deficiencies in the ways of working with the CAM program. We'll be asking for course corrections. That is something that we do with every program, but we're also, a number of the resettlement agencies are really engaged in a much wider way to look at, the bigger picture. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Joanne from LIRS, who's going to talk a little bit more. I've been mostly talking about the in-country and in-transit piece. She's going to talk a little bit more about the U.S. piece. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joanne Kelsey, and I work with the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Before I get started, I wanted to let you all know that we are one PowerPoint slide and two presenters away from opening this up for bigger discussion and lunch. So thank you. You guys have been incredibly attentive and engaged, and I'm impressed because it can feel like a long morning. What I'm going to touch very briefly upon, just to sort of round out our program, are the protection concerns we have for kids who, for whatever reason, decide not to go through the in-country processing program. Maybe they don't qualify. Maybe they can't wait. Maybe they have such an immediate protection concern they just have to leave. And they come to the United States seeking protection. So Anna gave a very good overview of what happens in country, what can happen around, and I think some folks have talked about some of the interdiction issues we're seeing with people trying to get here. Some of these kids may come alone, they may come with family members. The first thing we're worried about when they finally make it to our borders is whether or not they'll be allowed in to seek asylum, right? So we saw in the summer of, last summer, 2014, we all saw the images and have worked with children who were in the Border Patrol stations where they were mistreated, they weren't fed, et cetera. Adults were forced to sign away their rights. We all know that happens. One of the fears is that the in-country processing program could embolden Border Patrol to say, dude, you were supposed to apply for this back in your country, you can't come in, right? So we want to make sure that doesn't happen, and one of the ways I think that we could collaborate is if you guys are talking to your clients and they've overheard kids being told that, or they've overheard adults being told that, family members, whatever. It would be helpful for those of us doing advocacy on this issue to know that you're hearing that. It's an opportunity to maybe do some education with CBP to raise up these specific examples. Because we often, one thing I will say, and this wasn't part of my script, but I'm going to put it out there anyway to the service providers, is as an advocate, it is so hard when we don't have specific case examples of issues. So if you guys ever can send them our way, like if you don't have the resources to be up on the Hill, we would happily take any examples you have on these issues with us. So that's our first concern. Another concern is the detention of asylum seekers. So we've heard from Greg, we heard from Aria about the family detention facilities and the issue of that so many of these folks in the facilities are asylum seekers. And we could have a whole other 4-hour discussion about conditions in detention, how difficult it is to represent yourself and to get a lawyer, and I think a lot of you know this, so we're not going to get into that here, but just to raise it as a protection concern for these folks coming from Central America, and to highlight that most of the people in the facilities, I think 99.9% of the folks in family detention are from Central America, and I think we heard the statistic from Greg that 70% have passed a credible fear, so it's a pretty high number. Some more points that we could all collaborate on protection are to oppose some of the proposed legislation that we're seeing coming out of Congress. So there's been efforts to roll back the TVPRA, efforts to limit screening for kids, to take the screenings that the Mexican and Canadian kids get, which is pretty limited, and make that apply to all children, to narrow the definition of unaccompanied alien child so very few children can qualify again for the TVPRA protections. You've seen attempts to higher the standards to get asylum. So if we can work together, lots of groups in this room already work to limit these and to try to, in fact, go the other way, but again, I think it's a place that we can all work together. And finally, without getting too much into family detention, because again, we've talked about it a lot, just to reiterate that we've got to get the administration to see this as a refugee flow. This is not a border crisis, and that, I think, will change the treatment of this population. So with that, I thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to Bill Frelick.
Thank you. First, I wanted to thank Jen and the organizers of the conference for giving me an opportunity to speak at all. I'm actually a critic of this program. I think it's a bad program. And so I'd actually signed up just to be in the audience, and I think my reputation preceded me, and they graciously allowed me to come to offer a critique of what all of us have heard today. And I'm not really laying out new facts on the program per se, but I am really making a plea that as humanitarians, you're good-hearted people. You want to do the right thing. You want to help people. But be careful that you're not being duped. Be careful that there's not a political agenda here to create a certain narrative and to engage in practices that will do more harm than good. And of course, in humanitarian work, that's the bottom line. Are you doing more good than harm, or vice versa? And I would suggest that in the history of the U.S. in-country processing programs that we've seen on the screen, and only a few of us, I think, in this room, Anastasia and a few others, have been intimately involved in some of these earlier processes, can speak to how in-country processing in many respects were rights-violating processes that actually did more harm than good. And I want to refer a little bit to some of that history. But first, I think you need to look at the contradiction, the fundamental contradiction about what it is to be a refugee. And to look at that very carefully, because a refugee proves that they're a refugee first and foremost by running and getting the hell out of there and fleeing because they have got no other choice. They don't hang around after their persecutors threaten their lives. They don't hang around after they've been bombed and abused. They get the hell out of there, and then we try to pick up the pieces. It's chaotic. It's not managed. It's not orderly. It is chaotic, and that's the nature of the refugee reality. To change that into a process where you take a number and you wait in line and you go for 4 interviews and you go back and forth and you need to have an address and telephones and paperwork is perfectly appropriate for an immigration program. But for protecting people who are in danger, it's a sham. It's laughable. And so be careful how you label that as well. Little history. Orderly departure program has been touted as one of the models for this. That's what the first, I think, in-country processing program, by which, under the Comprehensive Plan of Action, the idea explicitly was to stop the boat flow of Vietnamese boat people, and to get people that were in camps of first asylum to go back to Vietnam. And so the price of getting resettled to the United States was for Vietnamese who had fled their persecutors, who had fled Vietnam, to go back to Vietnam and wait in line, take a number, and be orderly processed to the United States. And essentially what you had to do was to say, I'm not really a refugee, in order to get processed as a refugee. And 80,000 people, opted to do just that. And it succeeded in stopping the boat flow. In 1989, 70,000 boat people. By 1992, 41. The situation in Haiti was even more egregious. The interdiction had been at one point stopped with an injunction. The Supreme Court allowed the Bush 1 administration to resume interdiction. This was in January '92, and that same month is when they started in-country processing. Interdiction and in-country processing went completely hand in hand. And the justification that was used is, we're interdicting people and we're sending them back summarily with no processing whatsoever back to Haiti, but hey, they can line up and they can be processed there in an orderly way. They don't have to go on boats. And And when Clinton came in, he continued the policy, and he actually said, quote, "You can apply from within Haiti," as a justification for that. And then he put a cordon of 22 Coast Guard cutters, naval boats that stopped the flow completely coming out of Haiti. The numbers went from 40,000 in 92 to 4,000 in 93 to almost none after that, because people just, weren't able to flee anymore. The number of people that applied in country processing in Haiti went through the roof. You had 106,000 people that were applicants for in-country processing. They decided about 10,000, 11,000 cases. They rejected about 10,000 of those. It was an approval rate of cases decided of about 7.7%. Many of those people were actually left stranded on the tarmacs because they actually had to stop commercial flights out of Haiti because the situation in the country was so bad. And when I was there and seeing, again, they had to go for 4 interviews, had to go back and forth, had to have addresses, had to be literate, had to, be able to be contacted. And in addition to all that, and I was there on the sidewalk watching these people lining up across from a police station to line up for their interviews, and they were literally attacked by Tonton Mokut, who came and forced people out. So many people never got interviews at all. Most of them never got interviews at all, and others couldn't come forward. And the explicit criteria for the program was a criteria that was a well-founded fear of persecution, plus you had to be an elite. You had to be a journalist or a close associate of Aristide or whatever. So in addition to having to be have a house and an address and be literate and can do all the paperwork, which many, many Haitians that were going on boats were illiterate and they were already internally displaced. This required you to be essentially an elite in the first place. So how does this relate to what we're looking at? We're looking at a new interdiction program that essentially is taking place not with boats, but in Mexico. And we've seen, and the report that I really recommend to you that's already been mentioned, the Washington Office of Latin America, WOLA, shows that there is a U.S.-funded this dual Operation Rescue Angels and Operation Coyote 1 that is stopping children from leaving Honduras, stopping them from leaving their country in the first place and pushing them back, and not sending them to DNAF, which is the Child Welfare Agency, just simply pushing them back. And the U.S. Medina Initiative program is geared towards enforcement on the southern border of Mexico, with millions and over $100 million in surveillance money going into that. The number of people in the first 8 months of 2014 that have been interdicted and sent back from Mexico is 63,000 in the first 8 months. So if you're wondering what happened to those numbers that were coming into Texas last year, they're not getting past the southern border of Mexico. Thomas A. Shannon of the State Department in testimony before the Senate Appropriations Committee in July 2014 said that the point of this initiative was to stem the flow of migrants, quote unquote, and, quote, to improve the ability of Mexico and Guatemala to interdict migrants before they cross into Mexico. So I just leave you with this thought. We've been through this before. Humanitarian agencies, many of the agencies, maybe not the same faces, but the same agencies around this table, were involved in other in-country processing programs. Some of them are fine. You have the Lautenberg Amendment. They changed the refugee definition of refugees. They bring it to essentially making an immigration program. Well and good. Do family reunification. Do whatever you want. Preferably, don't call it a refugee program. Don't pretend that it's protection. The reason UNHCR is not fundamentally involved in this is because they're not refugees. They're not people who have fled their country. That's the threshold of who a refugee is. And any program, and this goes historically back to the beginning, that does in-country processing is really mischief-making with what it is to be a refugee, and the red flag should be up, because real refugees, people who really have to flee for their lives, are going to be harmed by a narrative that says, go back and wait in line. We don't want this, we don't want this to be unmanaged. We want to manage this. We want this to be legal and lawful. We don't want you, in the name of humanitarianism, to take a dangerous journey on a rickety boat, or to go on La Bestia and the train in Mexico. Heaven forbid you should harm yourself. No, the human right is the right to leave. That's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The right to leave. Think back to the Berlin Wall. You don't know what people are leaving until they actually have to flee and make the chance, go across the minefield, go across the Berlin Wall. You also have the right, Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to seek asylum from persecution in other countries. That's a right. This program is serving to undercut that right. And finally, the right of non-refoulement, when essentially what is going to end up happening is, no, it won't be a violation of the principle of non-refoulement. We're not returning you to El Salvador or Honduras or Guatemala because you never left the country. It's going to be completely discretionary. It's completely political. We can just deny you, reject you. And there's no legal, moral obligation whatsoever. There's no violation of the principle of non-refoulement because you never get a chance to flee. Anyway, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I hope you at least think about it as you move forward with this program. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill. I think one thing that I hope every single person in the room agrees with is that the messaging on this is wrong. So the extent, the government's messaging of what the situation is wrong. So, the extent that we can work together to change that, whether you agree with the program or you don't, or you're involved in the program or not, I think that is a really important takeaway for me. We're at a stage where we're doing Q&A. We also have, what is the situation with lunch, Jen?
So this, thank you. I'm Naomi with Refugee Council. This isn't specific, Anna, to your last session, but since we seem to be opening it up, I guess I'm wondering. I've heard a lot of recommendations for what we should be considering for next steps in terms of local collaboration, advocacy that we can be doing together and doing differently. But I'm wondering what mechanisms we need to have in place, perhaps as RCUSA, to make sure this actually happens. So we've heard a lot of really good ideas, but for example, how are we actually going to make sure that the resettlement agencies and Community X are in touch with the immigrant serving community? So if we could think about some real mechanisms at this point, I think that would be really helpful.
Do we have ideas, or I don't necessarily know that I'm in a position to sort of do a nice sketch for you on that, but
Because what I'm wondering is, Lord knows I'm not a fan of more of the SERFs, but I'm wondering if there is a way that we here in this room can stay in touch, and as we're thinking about how to move forward, to make sure that we know who the appropriate points of contact are.
Mm-hmm. Any ideas on that? I think one suggestion that came out earlier was really the need to map where you are versus where we are, and so I think that's something very concrete. How that actually, how we actually get there is another question, but I think that's something that we need to do. Arya also mentioned the idea of, in a few sites, piloting more multilateral coordination and information sharing on this program. Okay. Other questions, comments, discussion points? Oh.
Am I? Right here. Hi. I just have a question based on what you were just saying, Bill. Do you, anyone else can answer this also, but are your thoughts that recommending people to try to take advantage of this program and showing that people are interested would be harmful? Or would it also be harmful if no one applies for this program and the government thinks, oh, no one needs help? Like, what strategy do you recommend we take?
As I said before, I wouldn't have any objection to a family reunification program that is truthful about what it is. I think a program that purports to protect people that doesn't really protect them, it doesn't offer any safety whatsoever for the long, long process that people have to undergo, that in terms of the criteria, the people that are going to be eligible for it is a minuscule number of people. So not only is there a risk that you're being duped yourselves, the people around this room, but that you're in turn going to be providing false hope to people in the communities out there when you know damn well that they're not going to be eligible for this program, and only a very, very small number of people that are used to justify harmful interdiction that is going to harm tens of thousands more people than could possibly be helped by the handful of people that are going to qualify for this program. And you think yourself, who's going to qualify? The complications of gang violence, and these are complex refugee status determinations that are in the hands of people that have there's no legal appeal, there's no this is not a legal process, it's a political process, it's a discretionary process. And so, whether they water the definition up or they water the definition or make it higher as they did for the Haitians, the fact of the matter is that protecting people that are really in harm's way is not going to happen through this program. And if you tell people that you are going to protect them through this program, you're lying to them.
If I can interject a few things, Bill and I are very good friends and agree to disagree on a few items, and one of them is in-country processing, which can in fact be an avenue of protection for many, many people. However, it does not, and we agree on this, it cannot replace refugee processes in other ways. So I would say that the U.S. refugee law actually does include in-country as one of the definitions. None of the U.S. resettlement processes in any of the countries offer protection. And as I noted in the beginning, if you are an urban refugee or a camp refugee who is accessing this program, you are going through not only the 4 interviews that we outlined in this process, but also potentially a UNHCR process, which took several years to go through. And at no point in the U.S. refugee program do they then say, oh, this person is perhaps going to be homeless or in intense danger and we need to move them. There is an expedited process, and I would urge you all to think about this if in fact you do have clients who have been put into this program and there is an immediate issue, or even the child did have to flee and cross the border, that you actually inform the resettlement agency of that, so that there can be a request for a different emergency process. But I will also say that we have advocacy issues, and let's make sure that we don't drop them, and that we don't say, oh, we're happy with this in-country process. None of us are. We're happy that something is happening, but we need to make it a bigger process. So let's make sure that we separate maybe these two questions of a process versus the bigger advocacy ask.
If I could just make 2 comments as well, which are complementary to what Anastasia just said. The moral dilemma that Bill pointed out is present throughout the refugee program. It's not just within country. You have countries like Australia that use the fact that they are a resettlement country as one of the many pretexts for enforcement to keep asylum seekers away from their shores or to detain them under horrific conditions. So there are particular historical examples, and I think many of us in the resettlement community are very sympathetic to many of Bill's points. But just to say that it's a moral dilemma that doesn't exist only within country processing, although there are certain aspects which certainly are different. The second point I wanted to make, and this goes to your question of, like, how do I deal with this moral dilemma in my work? I think there is a clear distinction between doing advocacy and providing legal services. This program exists. It provides an immigration benefit. And if you have a client that wants to avail themselves of that, I would think you have an ethical obligation to help them do that in the best way possible. If your organization wants to also advocate on these issues, we would love for you to join us. So or to join Bill. Whatever way that your organization sees this program in the bigger picture, I think that is amazing. But I think there is a clear distinction between providing legal services with the immigration pathways that exist versus advocating for a different approach. More questions, comments? Yes.
Well, I had a question more about the determination of parole for the children. Is there any idea as to how they'll be adjudicating those requests and what the standard will be? What will be the considerations?
We don't 100% know yet. Like Anastasia explained, if a child is rejected for refugee status, they have the option to file a request for reconsideration, so a quasi-appeal, although without many due process guarantees, but a quasi-appeal nonetheless. They don't need to wait for a decision on an RFR before they go to the parole. They will be automatically bumped into a parole process, and presumably if they are not ineligible, if they're inadmissible to the United States and that's the reason they were denied in first instance, then no, they won't be bumped to parole. But if they're admissible, it will be bumped to the parole section. We don't really know what that process is going to look like. We don't know whether they're going to apply parole as sort of, well, the DNA testing came back positive, it's a family reunification case, it's a compelling need for family reunification, grant parole, or whether they're going to be looking at other aspects of their situation or their claim. We don't really know that, and we are asking those questions to try to get at that point. Anastasia, is anything else you want to mention on that?
Just only to say that from what we understand, the decision to offer parole will happen at the refugee interview. However, that doesn't mean that in other words, if they found you not eligible for a persecution claim, they might then decide they're going to offer you parole right then and there, but they can't actually grant parole right then and there. They have to actually have the affidavit of support, et cetera, that would establish that there's someone in the U.S. who can support you. So the offer of the status going forward does not actually equate the parole status.
Yeah, and the consular process for that will look different because it's linked to the resettlement program.
Yeah, just let me add one more thing on the advocacy side with respect to parole, and that is Joanne mentioned the really bad bills that are in Congress right now that are wreaking havoc with a lot of the aspects of unaccompanied children. But one of the provisions of the bill that's in the House is limitation on the use of the parole authority. That would, and I'm quoting from the bill here, that for aliens who have applied for or have been found to be ineligible for refugee status would no longer be able to use even the limited benefits that we put on the board of what parole would offer to them. So, there's an effort even to chop out that parole option for those who don't qualify under the refugee standard.
Other questions, comments, ideas for collaboration, next steps, lunch? People are getting hungry, maybe?
Just to return to our earlier discussions, taking in everything that has been said, and being thoughtful and sensitive to all the different points of view. I think it would be great in thinking about next steps of pulling in some of the ideas that various people brought up of possibly doing stakeholder meetings, combining that with a workshop. I didn't mention this, but Arnold and Porter, who is here today, they have offered pro bono legal support services and translation services to help support local outreach here. So I think there are some opportunities that we can take advantage of now that we're here around the table for those that are interested in thinking about ways that we could outreach to community if you're so inclined. And I think that also identifying resources is really important. You'll see the handouts that are here. Some of them have been created by NGOs and some of them by the government. And for those of us that have worked in the communities, they look really complicated. It would be hard to hand that to somebody and expect that they understand the contours of the program. So I think identifying some ways to make the resources more accessible to the communities that we work with would be a potential next step as well.
If I could just add to that, in terms of further workshopping or further events, I mean, we might want to think going forward into doing some type of gatherings which are very legal services outreach oriented, and maybe separate gatherings with maybe separate people from your institutions, more on the advocacy piece, to the extent that your organizations may want to engage in advocacy on these issues. Just because, I mean, I think most of you all already do amazing advocacy on immigration issues, and but it might not be the same person in your agency that needs to be at those two tables. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Naomi from Refugee Council USA.
Okay, so thank you again for everyone for coming and participating today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm hoping that all of you did too, and we had some good debate too, which is always fun. So we've had a lot of opportunity for questions, but this really is the last call. Is there any issue that you feel like we didn't touch on today? This is not the last opportunity, because as I said, I'm hoping this is the start of a long-term dialogue, but is there something that you really want to get out there right now? It could be on any portion of this. I see somebody.
Thanks. Emma Buckout from the Latin America Working Group. Sorry, I missed a lot of the morning. I just wanted to highlight sort of what Anna and Bill were getting at as far as sharing the stories between the direct legal service providers and those of us that are doing the advocacy and the foreign policy advocacy here in DC, just so that we're highlighting the ways that the in-country processing is not protecting a large group of people. And I'm sure that's already been underlined. But just any specific stories of someone who's arrived in the U.S. who couldn't get access to in-country processing, those specific stories that we can bring to state or Congress help a ton. So just in thinking about future gatherings, ways to sort of link between those two functions is hugely helpful.
Anything else? Okay. Well, you should know that the materials that you've seen today, as well as the materials that were out there on the tables, will be circulated. So it'll be good for you to have to be able to share with your groups and the communities with which you're working. And also to let you know that we will be thinking, I think, about how we can make sure that the communication among all of us is robust and continues, so that we can, in fact, actually implement these suggestions that we've talked about at the local level. And so we will be sure to get back in touch once we figure out the proper way to do that. But we have all of your contact information, so rest assured knowing that you'll be part of the conversation moving forward. So thanks again to Ayla, and go get lunch if you haven't already done so. And we have access to the room for a little bit longer, so please feel free to come back in and just eat and talk with your colleagues.